But perhaps sort of that withdrawal of hot money really is a good opportunity for Egypt to sort of review its investment promotion plans and start thinking of what is the best way to really diversify the industry to attract productive investment as opposed to just people buying treasury bonds.
The fact that the Egyptian economy has kind of come to a bit of a standstill, not as bad as in other countries like South Africa where we have a complete lockdown, but because of the nightly curfew, it is cramping or impacting the economy. And in fact, you have Egyptian businessman Naguib Sawiris, who's publicly criticized the lockdown, saying this is a terrible idea. We can't afford to do this. But what are the options really? Because you have a pandemic, you have to act to it, but then you also have this economy that was just starting to pick up again, and now it could very well just fall back.
It's possible. To be very honest, people who are saying that they want factories running again are not the people who are standing on the factory floor, and they're not the people who sort of have to push into public transportation carts that are super busy to go to work and go home to their family, having been exposed potentially to a lot of people who may not be, who may have been contagious, right? So talk is cheap, especially on part of people like this gentleman. It is, it really depends on what we're trying to prioritize here. Are we trying to prioritize people's lives and consequently, we do whatever it is that we have to do on the short term to protect the population, or are we willing to take a gamble on this? And I really think, or I really hope that all governments will sort of choose the former option and happily ignore the calls of people who are talking about reopening the economy and so on, when we clearly haven't reached the peak of the crisis yet.
In terms of funding for public health services, how has that been in Egypt? Because we keep hearing a lot of international criticism that now is the time when many African countries should have realized that they should not have neglected that sector.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, that we are in a time when not only is there like a massive pressure on the health systems of the different countries, but also because the borders are closed, then the people who are often policymakers or people are close to their circles who normally would tend to seek treatment overseas no longer can because they're locked into the country. Now they have to face sort of the consequences of their investment or lack thereof in the health sector. I mean, so far, a lot of African countries, North Africa certainly, hasn't yet come under immense stress, just because I think of where we are in the crisis cycle. Most projections suggest that we're going to have greater numbers coming up of infections and of people who sort of require intensive care and so on. Now countries are sort of realizing that we should have invested more in better health infrastructure. We should have invested more in training of medical personnel. And there's something also that we're coming to realize now is how we probably should have taken care a little bit more of the relations between people and medical personnel, right? So Egypt is quite far from what you've seen in, say, a number of European countries where people have been sort of celebrating their medical staff. We haven't been doing that very much. There was a doctor who passed away from COVID-19, and they tried to take her back to her village, and the villagers refused to actually allow the family to bury her in her home village, right? And the police had to intervene, and it was kind of a mess. So there's quite a number of things that we will have to reckon with when it comes to how poorly the health sector is or has been sort of invested. I don't know if we will do that when the crisis is over, or if we will go back to sort of, the way things were.
And the way things were was that the private sector was gaining more and more clients, and the public sector was just getting less and less investment from the government. Is that kind of a fair way to generalize it?
If we look at the percentage of the national budget that has been going into education and health, then over sort of the past two budgets, we see a decline in percentages, right? So even if the overall number may have slightly increased, but we know that this has gone down in the list of government priorities in terms of spending. So that's one side of it. The other side of it, which I've always found very concerning, is that sort of the relationship is quite poor between people and doctors. So anyone who's been a doctor in an ER in Egypt will tell you that one of the biggest risks that they are exposed to is actually violence from the families of patients, as opposed to sort of the regular hazards that they have to deal with. In terms of coverage, In mid 2019, however, Egypt passed a new legislation for comprehensive health insurance, and they've been piloting that in some parts of the country. They started with the Northeast, and that hasn't sort of been piloted countrywide. But yeah, so hopefully there are plans for ensuring that people have more access to public hospitals and that people are covered with medical insurance, whereas the majority of people really are out of it. But it is clear that private health sector in Egypt is booming. There's a lot of investment coming into private hospitals and so on. It's actually not a bad thing to have the two systems operating in parallel, as long as the public sector health system is decent enough, right? It is, however, a nightmare if we are encouraging one on the account of the other.
Are any health services being provided on behalf of the state for those in the informal sector or unregistered workers, or like you said, without any social safety net?
In emergency, they have access to the same public hospitals as everyone does, but the quality of it is fairly low. And more importantly, right now, in the current conditions that we're at, they are unable to abide by the government regulations of self-isolation and staying at home and so on, because they literally cannot afford to take time off, because if they do, they lose their jobs. So the informal sector is also quite a severe element of weakness when it comes to dealing with the crisis, because they are unable to stop working, because otherwise they have no livelihood. But it's interesting because sort of our experience with the informal sector in past crises has been, however, that the informal sector sort of tends to go back to work quicker than the formal sector, right? So in the past times that Egypt has had curfews, so for instance, 2011, 2013, we saw that the informal sector went back to work, went back to production, went back to supplying goods to the lower quintile of society, which depend on informal production. So it's important in a way to sort of not just support people in the informal sector because of their right as citizens to sort of gain support from the state, but also because when it comes to restarting the economy, they will actually be very important.
You had measured that they've capped cash withdrawals from banks. They've also cut interest rates. But the Egyptian pound has remained relatively firmer than other currencies against the dollar. And I was wondering, how have they been able to do that?
So I don't actually think there are massive pressures on the Egyptian pounds right now, or rather more so than other currencies. In terms of the measures that they've done for the banking sector, yes, we mentioned that they reduce interest rates. They're trying to encourage lending. They're trying to forgive the fees and fines for late payments, not performing loans, and whatnot. They have removed ATM withdrawal caps at some point, if I'm not mistaken, and they've removed the fines and fees attached to that, and so on. So I mean, yeah, I mean there isn't much monetary pressure, shall we say, on the Egyptian pound for now, but what remains to be seen when it comes to the things that are being done in the banking sector is whether it is actually sufficient for people and for small companies that sort of depend on credit lines and depend on credit facilities and loans to get their business going. Like, this is really the main concern for me when it comes to all the measures that we're taking in the banking sector.
The fact that the government has already spent about $1.27 billion to support the stock market, but it's also intervened by propping the currency by tapping into its foreign reserves of about $45 billion. Does that show the government's become a little bit too much heavy-handed, as in, the pre-2016 ways, or is that just a way of sort of offsetting any possible shocks to the system?
So Egypt has indeed a number of policies when it comes to the banking sector. So we mentioned that the central bank has reduced the interest rate by 3 percentage points. They're encouraging lending. They instructed the banks to forgive late payments and non-performing loans and to extend credit facilities to all the companies that are using lending in this period for sort of their working capital and to cover salaries and so on. I mean, these measures seem to be okay. At this point, I think the main thing that is missing from them is more industry-specific measures. So more measures that would target, for instance, small and medium enterprises, that remains needed and necessary. Regarding the currency, so as it stands, we know that over the past 2 months, the foreign reserves have gone down from 45.5 to 40 billion US dollars because the government has needed to sort of release some foreign currency in the market to help support the exchange rate to avoid any kind of sort of speculative manipulation. But the numbers that we have at this point, so that I think that remains very much within limits of a crisis like that. So I don't think there's much concern or much pressure on the Egyptian pound currently. So the exchange rate will probably remain more or less stable, maybe perhaps like a small decline coming up next month because of the high consumption that is related to the month of Ramadan. But that's sort of the cyclical type of pressure that you have on the currency. But generally speaking, I don't think we have any serious pressures on that.
Okay, a different sector for me was the military. Now, Egypt, of course, has a huge sector. Algeria
Sure.
as well. I was wondering, will that take a hit at all, or are those one of those protected sectors that no matter what the situation, the governments will not allow that to be touched?
That's actually a really interesting question. Like military industries, insofar as they supply to the public, they nevertheless depend on sort of the public's purchasing power, right? So if we have a spike of unemployment, as we currently do, a lot of people will simply not be able to afford the things that they used to afford before the crisis, and therefore, even the military-owned civilian industries will take a partial hit. This being said, given their dominant position, given their ability to outcompete, whether it's sort of honestly or dishonestly, with the private sector, they will not suffer massively. So they still supply for a lot of their production, for instance, is consumed by the army itself, among other things. This is a market that is guaranteed. They will still be able to wrestle private sector operators for a place in a shrunken market in a way. That actually puts a really interesting point on whether the recovery plans of the countries with large military industries, whether they will actually be able to put that into consideration when it comes to supporting their industries in the aftermath of the crisis, or whether they will still pretend that they don't see the relation between the dominant role of the military industries in the market and the effect on the private sector. Right, so there will actually be a very interesting moment of sort of a reckoning on the part of those governments on whether they're willing to really address that issue or pretend that it doesn't exist, as they tend to do on average.
There's been a lot of, if we look at Egypt, there was a huge discrepancy between what was officially being said in terms of figures and what outside sources are saying is probably the actual figure. And all across North Africa, we're seeing very, very low numbers by comparison to just across the Mediterranean, and the numbers are, skyrocket high. So how much trust is there in what's the government's telling their citizens and officially to the WHO and everywhere? And why the lack of transparency in a time like this when everyone is going through the same problem?
Question of trust between governments and citizens is extremely important, not just because people are panicked and they're very thirsty for good information, but also the presence or absence of trust means whether people will sort of follow the guidelines that the governments are publishing, right? And as you mentioned, across North Africa, you have numbers that may seem to be very far from the truth. Right now, both Algeria and Egypt are sort of talking about 2,000, 2,100 cases. And for a lot of people and a lot of studies are estimating that might be below reality. Of course, the extreme case of this is Libya, which so far has, by mid-April, has 25 confirmed cases and one death altogether, right? So it's important that we sort of wonder whether governments are being honest or not, and whether people trust them to implement measures. In terms of the honesty, I will sort of go against my regular, my first impulse of distrusting the governments in that part of the world, is that a lot of the numbers may be underestimated, not out of malice, but out of inability to generate better numbers, right? Because a lot of the countries are quite severely constrained when it comes to testing capabilities, for instance. I think the numbers are probably underestimating the reality, I don't think it's very much because the governments are setting out to deliberately lie and mislead the people. The trust